Well, welcome everybody. Thanks very much indeed for coming for what is going to be a celebration and a bit of an interrogation of this fine book here. And the author, of course, is Andrew Brooks, who's sitting right next to me here. The way it's going to work, there'll just be extremely brief words from me, just introducing a few thoughts, and then Andrew, I think, has got a few words to say about the book as like an opening statement. Then we'll have a bit of a chat. We're hoping definitely to leave at least sort of, I don't know, a fat 20 minutes for questions from the floor. So please do start thinking about what you want to know from this book, or what you want to discover that Andrews thinks about it and why he wrote it and all those kind of things. And yeah, and then there'll be more beer and crisp later, I gather, and some red wine. So for those of you who don't know, my name is Tom Heap. I've been a broadcaster and journalist in environment, rural, transport, climate change for at least 25 years now. I am a geographer by background. I did geography at university at UCL. Right, I'm leaving. And don't miss a chance to big it up for geography, which I think is a very fine subject. And it's particularly good actually for journalism, because there's quite a lot about being able to understand the sort of broader picture, not being too narrow, and also not being terrified of numbers and figures like a lot of my entirely arts-educated journalist colleagues are. They have no conception of a proportion or a percentage or anything like that, and will run a mile from a figure and frankly believe it's not their job to judge whether it's plausible or not. So geography by background, and yeah, I've been doing a lot of this stuff in science and environment broadcasting. Nowadays, I used to be with BBC News. I've now moved into doing Countryfile, a big Sunday night TV countryside show, which at the danger of a bullshit comparison, people say, what's your role in Countryfile? And I said, well, I do the journalistic, I do the sort of journalistic bit, the more investigation bit. And I said, a lot of people describe Countryfile as a warm bath. Well, my bit is a warm bath with a good book. So I don't know whether you think that's bullshit comparison or not. You can tell me later. So that a lot of work on Radio 4, Costing the Earth, which is now dead. Rare Earth Reborn is the new show that I do on Radio 4, and until recently I had a show on Sky News and a few other bits and bobs as well, and a few books. But we're all about this book today, and I'm really intrigued because it seemed to me, it's funny, so much language is based on metaphor, is that you suddenly feel very conscious of it when you're talking about it. But it seems to me that you've used this question, this sort of idea about comparison, this idea about metaphor as, if you'll forgive me, a sort of a tool, a sort of oyster knife to open up various issues that clearly mean a lot to you and you think illuminate some of the issues with where we are in our politics and our planet and our geopolitics. But what was it that made you reach for that tool, this idea of, comparisons and false comparisons and bullshit comparisons being a way to get in there? Because in many ways this is as much about linguistics as it is about geography or politics.
First of all, thank you so much, Tom, for a great introduction, and I'll finish off on some thank you notes, so please keep with us for that. And I want to start by answering that question by thinking about why is a geographer drawn to comparison, why thinking about the way that language is used and the kind of comparative tools that we operationalise, our metaphors, our models, and our metrics, and I'll probably unpack those phrases a little bit more as we go on. But why do geographers like comparison? If you indulge me, I'll start off with a little story from recently, a few weeks back. The book was already written, it was sitting on some digital files somewhere. Busy week as normal. I've been teaching at King's. It was Friday afternoon. I was picking my oldest son, Banner, up from school, and his teacher, Mr. Eves, they're always Mr. Eves or Miss or Mrs. You never know their full names. Mr. Eves said to me, "Oh, you're an academic geographer, aren't you? Could you come and speak to the kids next week?" So I couldn't really say no. So a few days later, comes round, and he said to me quite briefly, "I just want you to talk to them about geography. We're doing geography as our topic at the moment. I know you've written an atlas. Can you come and speak to the kids about this, about geography?" So I was like, "Oh God, I can speak to 18-year-olds, master's students. I've had PhD students. What do I do with little 6-year-olds?" So I arrived in the classroom. we're all sat down there, cross-legged on the floor. Say hello, and they all say, hello, Barra's dad. So you lose your identity. And then I begin to sort of think to them, I had a few questions sort of prepared. So started off with, which way is north? Actually, let's go, which way is north, guys? Yeah, that's the, you did better than the 6-year-old. So the 6-year-old was like this, they were like that, they were like this. So that one didn't go so well. So we didn't know which way is north. Okay, so the next question I went on to is, what is geography? I thought that was a bit more of a tenuous one for 6-year-olds. But, and this is the complete truth, one of them straight away, hand straight up, and she said, it's comparisons. We've been comparing Shanghai with Bristol. And that for me was, this would have been a great way to look at the book with birth, but the book wasn't birthed at this moment, the book was already done and dusted. But to me, that sort of cemented this idea that a lot of geography, even from the age of 6 years old, year 1 of school, we get taught to think about the word comparison. So from that point, I sort of filed that away. I knew that would be useful.
I'm sorry, I was going to interrupt you there. Is that in effect because when we think of one place, we're inevitably comparing it to another? Or is that why you think comparison enters into geography? Is that what roots that?
Yeah, well, I'd say geography is, to me, it's the tension between two things. And this comes from Doreen Massey. I'm sure some of you, the geographers in the room, will be familiar with Doreen. Great scholar, unfortunately passed away about 6 years ago now. And she said that geography was two things. It's the uniqueness of places, and it's the interconnection of places. And those interconnections can be flows of migrants, of money, of capital, of ideas, knowledge, of goods, of services, of carbon. So geography is about that uniqueness of place and how that interfaces with a web of connections. So for me, like, as a geographer, comparison is really, really important. But also, I see it provides a lot of work, a lot of undergraduate dissertations, and I see oftentimes some quite poor comparisons. So rather than writing a really good project on gentrification in London, some students like to do a project which is comparing gentrification in, say, New York City. And in so doing, they tell me about the differences between London and New York, but they do nothing to explain what's driving the processes of gentrification
in each place. Yes, you've reminded me of that phrase, compare and contrast. I don't think I've really had anyone ask me to do that for the last 30 plus years, more than that probably, since I was a student. But yeah, that is a staple of academia, isn't it, and not least geography.
So in so doing, I think we oftentimes, we look at things in how they contrast with somewhere else without thinking about what is that makes that place unique. What is it? How is it connected with global flows and connectivities? But we tend to rarefy the differences between two locations, and that's, as a geographer, that's interesting, and I work quite conceptually in terms of relational comparisons to understand and explain it. But this isn't an issue which is confined to geography. We can also think about that in history. Whenever there's a big event, a big moment, we tend to relate that to something which happened in the past. If there's a shipping disaster, it's the Titanic. If there's a war, it's related to a previous conflict. And likewise, people. If you have, and this can cut across different arenas. So I have a chapter which is quite light-hearted on sport, although there is serious tones to it. If someone's a new emerging sports star, that young woman or man is compared to the established greats in their field. They don't get the opportunity always to develop on their own terms.
And I'm going to come into some of these examples. I think they're really good fun. They're really illustrative. But just on that point, isn't to a certain extent comparison inevitable? Because it's a bit like that famous thing in statistics that one number doesn't mean anything. You always need it in relation to something else. And isn't that a little bit the same in some of the things you're talking about? That you need a context figure, a reference figure, even if not a comparison figure, to understand, whether this sprinter is any good, or whether this, New England female goalkeeper is any good.
Yeah, definitely. And I think this isn't a book against comparison. Obviously, but none of these bullshit comparisons. That doesn't mean every comparison's a negative thing. I don't think there's a comparisons lobby out there that I need to fight against. There's not someone at UCL writing amazing comparisons to rival text or whatever. But no, I think comparison's really important. And through comparisons we can understand differences and we can understand inequalities. But I think there was a real important kernel of truth in your question, because you talk about what is the model. And oftentimes the model is for comparison, and oftentimes the model is represents kind of established notions of good or greatness. So the model for comparison is often, maybe if it's talking about people, it's a white man, or it's a European experience which others get compared against. If it's a institution, it's the established greatness, and it's how everyone else is measured against that institution. So we tend to use comparisons to, we work on one model and we measure others against that, rather than necessarily thinking about how new sports people, maybe they're not going to be the next Pele, maybe they're going to play the game in a different way, maybe they're going to have a different way to offer different things to offer. But I think with comparison we tend to reify what went before, and we establish that as the kind of model against which it was measured.
And, excuse me, not least in sport, some of those things are incredibly sort of bankrupt comparisons, aren't they? They can be incredibly sort of lazy, really. Having said that, there's a whole industry of top tens in everything, which is by definition a comparison. So it clearly is used as a tool for understanding. We'll come to your top 100 Britons, which is something that's clearly animated you somewhat in this book. But let's just start with a geographical one. Lisbon is the new Barcelona.
Yeah.
A phrase that clearly got your goat.
So I love Lisbon. I think some of the audience have visited Lisbon with me. It's a beautiful city. It's a wonderful city. And it's a city which has been undergoing tremendous changes recently. It's had an explosion of tourists. Tourist numbers have increased by a factor of 5 in the last 10 years. There's hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of expats, of Europeans, of Americans, of tech entrepreneurs who are making it their home. And they're drawn to it for a particular set of kind of globalised values, because it's easy to navigate it with English. There's a visa regime which is very welcoming to outsiders. There is embraces kind of capital and technology. And all these things are fostering a city which has got a lot of buzz and energy and excitement about it. In tandem with those changes, there's a huge cost of living crisis for people who've lived in Lisbon all their lives, who can't afford to buy or rent homes in many of the historic central districts. Parts of the city have become almost like theme parks, where souvenir shops and tourist buses and overcrowding in the heights of summer push out the elements, the rhythms of urban life, which made it distinctively Portuguese capital. And from afar, we would think of a Lisbon or a Berlin or a Barcelona in relation to each other, in competition with one another. This kind of the way that they get compared to one another, and we consume them and package them as these kind of destinations that you visit briefly, that you have this consumable sort of experience of, is having a negative effect on urban life. And I think it's that driver of tourism and comparison which is part of the system.
I mean, the comparison for us from the outside is I guess, a tool, a springboard for travel choices. But are you saying, in effect, that actual comparison, that almost competition between the cities, is actually worsening the life for many of the residents, at least those on, let's say, on lower incomes? Is that actually the act of comparing is harming them?
Well, I'm saying that, but also the residents of Lisbon say.
Right.
I think more importantly, their views would be what would come to the fore here. And a practical example of this occurring in Lisbon would be the Tech Summit, where Lisbon was actively, there's a big global tech summit where they get all the kind of would-be Elon Musks in, you get big international speakers, people like Blair have spoken there, Eric Cantona, everyone in between, to talk about like new movements in technology. It used to be in Dublin. Bono was kind of one of the celebrities associated with it. He took people on a pub tour of Dublin. But now it kind of, Lisbon out-competed Dublin and kind of captured this conference, faced with competition from Amsterdam and London and elsewhere. And now it really glorifies and celebrates that conference. But that the conference is a kind of signal example of the way in which it's been pitching itself comparatively to other cities, and it's won that competition. And now the arrival of that conference has been a vanguard for a whole series of plane loads of tech entrepreneurs and kind of the workation class.
Yeah.
The football issue.
It's interesting. It's not just over tourism, which I think is a fascinating subject in and of itself, and it is becoming more and more recognised as a not a scourge, might be unfair, but it's also these people aren't just tourists. They're often working there. They're not just going on package holidays. They're doing a lot. It's not just
and that's
somewhere to live or at least be for a short time.
And that's wonderful, and it's good for them. And I think travel and living and having the opportunity to live and work overseas is been something which has enriched my life tremendously. And I think it's a really important privilege and opportunity which should be available to everyone. But I think it's when it's done in a way which is unregulated, when it's done in a way where the city is orientating policies towards the outsiders, and the inflows of capital they bring at the cost of local people, is where it's problematic.
You've obviously got a bit of a connection to things Portuguese. I believe that makes you a Lusophile, which is a phrase I really like. Do you speak it? Fala português and all that?
Mais ou menos.
Because you spent a lot of time in Mozambique. Sorry, I should have said that as the other element to this.
So I mean, I came into the Lusophone world through Mozambique and Southern Africa. And then, as life draws on, you kind of come closer to home and moved work from looking at Mozambique to some of the issues in
I live up in Warwickshire, and there's a pub near us, pub restaurant, that was run by a Portuguese, classic sort of Portuguese immigrant story, loves Britain, and he has a flag outside, which mixes the Portuguese flag and the British flag, and it says Portugal, Britain's oldest ally.
Yeah.
Now, again, another comparator there, but I think that might be true. Ganged up against the Spanish.
Because one of the days of one before one. That's why port's so popular in the UK.
Right.
So that's why, because we couldn't get our French wines because we were at war with France. So we were getting our port as our table wine.
Well, let's talk about Mozambique, which earns its place in the book once again because you think of a completely, not so much bogus as just false comparison that it was, I can't remember, it was the fastest developing or one of the most successful post-colonial countries in Africa.
Yeah, and I think maybe if you haven't come with me with the Lisbon example, I think this is one which really drives home the way in which comparison can have material impact upon the lives of people. So in this case, sadly, tragically, some of the most impoverished people in the world. So for those of you who don't know, Mozambique is a country in southwest Africa, and consistently amongst the poorest. Let's go back to the mid-90s. It had just come out of a civil war which finished in '92. And it was amongst the poorest countries in the world, right to the absolute bottom, below your Afghanistans and your Sudans and so on. And life expectancy was low, wages were low, malnutrition was rampant. In the following 2 decades, it had tremendous period of GDP growth, 7, 8, 9% year on year, huge explosion of natural resources. Part of this was a peace dividend, because it was coming out of warfare into a period of peace. And there was exploitation of tropical hardwoods, of natural gases, aluminium refinery. And it was creating more and more millionaires. Bloomberg was pointing to it as a real concentration of millionaires in sub-Saharan Africa. In tandem with this massive growth, it was attracting the interests of donors. It was a so-called donor darling. There was money coming in from the World Bank, but also lots of bilateral funders, some of the Scandinavian countries, UK, EU, so on. And it was celebrated repeatedly as a success story. Multiple UN Secretary Generals, Kofi Annan, Ban Ki-moon visited it, said this is wonderful, this is a success story for Africa. This is, if anyone who thinks Africa is a failure, come to Mozambique, see what's happening. Tragically, at the same time that there was this big GDP growth, that there was this celebration in the international development community and amongst key policymakers, poverty, after an initial rise, stuck stubbornly low. In the UN's own development indicators, it's never escaped the kind of absolute bottom 5% of countries. Even though it was celebrated as this kind of beacon for Africa, this place which was meant to be the kind of golden child of development initiatives. So that takes us up to about 2010, 2012, the period when I was working there. We move further forward in time, and tragically for Mozambique, the story gets worse. Violence erupts, there's increasing tensions in the north of the country, and it's moving towards a failed state now. And Antonio Guterres, the current UN Secretary General, points to it as somewhere which is in need of
To what extent do you think that comparison with other countries, other African countries, which you think is bullshit, it masked the truth and allowed this negative spiral to continue?
Yeah, I think there was two things going on. One was that there was no impetus for local political change because it was being celebrated as a success story, because it was following the kind of policy prescriptions of external bodies. It was friendly to international investors. It was following the kind of governance prescriptions of the global north. But also, and importantly, and culturally, it was a lovely place to live. If you arrived there like I did, with my modest PhD stipend, I could live like a king. I had a wonderful lifestyle. And this was not like being in Afghanistan or Liberia or Sudan. You could go down to Kruger and go on safari, you could go out to the beach, you could have some prawns and cold beer. There was a party atmosphere. It was a place where it was like very kind of like compelling and attractive and beautiful place to be, at the same time as having immense poverty. So I honestly think that there was a big community within the donors, within the international diplomatic corps, which wanted to author this myth, they wanted to sustain this myth, this story that it was doing better than its neighbours. But it wasn't. It was no better than Malawi and Zambia. It was actually doing much worse than many of them. It was a completely bullshit comparison.
So I want to come to some non-geographical ones, but just one more in the geographical sphere. A lot of people, I think including myself at times, have referred to our efforts to combat climate change as a moonshot. We need to think of it as the moonshot of our generation, and indeed it's the implicit thinking behind the prize awarded by the Prince of Wales. The Earthshot Prize is clearly using that language. Why is it you think that is unhelpful?
Well, this is a good one. This is I think probably again there's two registers on this. The first one I think is a scalar problem. That getting to the moon in the 1960s, it seemed an almost impossible task. You had to bring all together these German rocket scientists. You had to bring together all these kind of technologies, guidance systems, life support systems. You had to do it safely. You had to marshal the technologies of a whole nation. Hundreds of millions, not hundreds of millions of people, but lots and lots of people within the US were involved in this huge engineering effort, which hadn't been sort of seen in the world, never seen the likes of it before. But it was only ever a small proportion of people within the US who were involved in this, and it lasted for less than a decade. And they got up there, Neil Armstrong and his mates came back home, and it was mission accomplished. So in a scale, it had a time boundness to it, time limits to it, and it only involved the resources of a small proportion of a very big and powerful nation, which was also motivated by the cultural glue of their rivalry with the Soviet Union. In contrast, the climate emergency, in terms of scale, involves not just a few 100,000 people in one very rich and powerful country. It requires everyone to work on this, and so the scale of effort required is not like we just need to have one really big technological fix project. So I think there's a scalar issue is huge. 8 billion versus maybe a couple 100,000 people. But secondly, I think the more important point is Neil Armstrong's back home, job done. The Apollo missions kind of limped on for a few years afterwards. They came back, they drove around in a buggy, they planted a flag, played golf, but there was nothing left to do. There's no job done on climate change. There's no resolution to climate change. It doesn't have that endpoint. It doesn't have a fixed goal, target to achieve. And the targets contain, is it 1 degree C, 1.5, 2 degrees? Is it a certain amount of carbon concentration in parts per million? Is it just climate change? Are we talking about ocean acidification, extinction, deforestation? We cannot agree even on what the target would be. And we can't put a time frame on that target. So I think the idea of a moonshot, an earth shot, a fixed target we can hit is not a comparison which works. So in terms of scale, and actual just the reality of the model of what's required is just incomparable.
But I suppose the reason one of the reasons I'm intrigued about it, not least, is you're good enough to print a paragraph of Kennedy's famous speech here about why we should do it. And I think if you substitute the words climate change or solve the climate change for moon, you get what would be a pretty galvanising thing for at least the political class and maybe the public class to get behind it. Here we go. We choose to solve climate change. We choose to solve climate change in this decade and do the other things not because they're easy, but because they're hard. Because that goal will serve to organise and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one we're willing to accept and unwilling to postpone, and one which we intend to win. Now, I think if you put that with climate change, that's powerful stuff, isn't it?
It's powerful in that way, but those are words of that period, with that man, and in that moment. And there's no one who's able to kind of bring people together in that way. That's not happened. And that will not happen through Biden saying it. I think Biden's probably got some people who've been to Harvard writing schools who can pen words as good as Kennedy's. And I think the words are not enough, because the words only have meaning in the moment.
But they're a very good springboard. I mean, this is one of the things I think about comparisons, is that they're a springboard for thought and conversation. And even the bullshit ones can be springboard.
Yeah.
Maybe they spring you off in the wrong direction, which is the issue.
Yeah. Well, I mean, maybe this is too much of the. Maybe I'm too close to the topic, even though I'm not a climate change, climate scientist. But I think maybe this was a language which would have worked 20, 30 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe actually, if someone, well, I'm never going to praise, but if someone like a Margaret Thatcher had said it.
Yeah. In a way it works.
25 years ago, 30 years ago. She did. She was. Yeah. Well, so if it was going to work, it would have worked.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe there's the argument. And actually, I think the comparison in global history is, for me, it's the Industrial Revolution, is what we need. And again, I'm not the person to write the policy. There's people in this room who are much better on this topic than me, but that does not have a definitive starting point. There was not some genius in Lancashire who was the first one who got a spinning jenny working. It wasn't someone who was pumping out no one can really think about where the Industrial Revolution started, and I think that's the same.
Or ended.
Or ended, yeah. So, and I think actually with the Industrial Revolution, we celebrate. You can go to these museums. I'm the kind of lazy dad who likes to think he's quite educational. So you take your kids to all these sort of agricultural museums or industrial museums, these heritage sites. You say, look at that tree and train, and we celebrate the kind of the infrastructure, the kind of the hard metal. These changes. But actually the Industrial Revolution was really about social change. It was about the factory, it was about changing generations, it was about remaking cities. That's what drove the real power of the Industrial Revolution, was social rather than technological. And I think likewise with the solution to climate change will probably be social rather than technological. But I'm outside of my corner. I'm not outside of my corner, but I'm in a room where I know there's people.
It seems to me they're quite clearly matched. The technical and the social have to gear together. Well, let's talk about one that isn't strictly geographical. It does actually link quite nicely with what you've just been saying, and this is about the 100 greatest Britons, of which, of course, memorably, in some ways, this is what I took away from it as being more surprising, is that Isambard Kingdom Brunel came second. which was partly down to the advocacy of Jeremy Clarkson, I have to say, who, like it or not, is a very formidable advocate and broadcaster. But however, no prizes for guessing who came first, Winston Churchill, and you have a problem with both, I think, the winner and the whole system.
Yeah, well, I mean, Churchill's a very complicated and controversial character, and I could give you a history lesson about what his actions, how they resulted in famine in Bengal, or they contributed to that, and had the extreme loss of life, the tens of millions of people who died in that, the tragedy which was associated with that.
Well, that's more about why you don't think he should win, rather than why you think the idea of 100 best or 10 best, because it's been done in lots of other countries around the world, as you talk about in your book.
So this model of a competition was that there was a kind of casting exercise where they chose 100 Britons on which the public could vote to choose their favourite. So a big exercise in comparing who was the greatest Briton. Within that list of 100, the only non-white person chosen was Freddie Mercury, who's often assumed to be white. That's European Asian heritage. And there was, I think it was 6 women out of a group of 100. So what this list is doing is kind of sort of calcifying, fossilising male greatness as white and male. And this matters because, in the first instance, because it's limiting the area of debate. This is not some sort of objective scientific competition. We're not measuring the largest grain sample or something. This is, by its very nature, this is a subjective exercise. But by limiting the debate to thinking about a particular subset of society, we've already put barriers on what greatness means. So greatness isn't a woman who raised an amazing family. It's not a migrant who lived himself out of poverty. It's a particular type of great man vision of history. But furthermore, in so doing, it tended to reify people who captured a particular sense of national identity, and what makes someone the greatest Briton is not someone who's done something for the world, but more often than not someone who's done something for the nation. And this pattern is repeated not just in the UK, but the competition is run across 27 countries. In Portugal, which we've already spoken about, the greatest Portuguese was Antonio Salazar, who was a long-time fascist dictator. In the US, it was Ronald Reagan. So you see these competitions, they capture a national identity as being a particular sort of alpha male, kind of nationalistic figure. And I think in so doing, they establish kind of comparison as being this sort of exercise in how we measure greatness. Doesn't think about, I'd rather turn the optics around and think about what makes a great society, who represents that. Think about the teams which make individuals rather than about particular.
There was my sort of TV broadcasting hat on here. This was a TV program, wasn't it? Yeah. And I'm not sure about if you can engineer and pitch a thing about make a great sound, the 100 greatest societies or whatever, and get it on telly, I'd be impressed. But it was about individuals, and I think that's one of the things that troubles me about this. Incidentally, it just come to me, I think that each Britain had a champion, and I think the champion for Churchill was Mo Mowlam, wasn't it? The Labour politician. I think it was, and quite revered in left-wing circles. Quite interesting. Let's just come on to some comparisons. There's a couple that you do like, but are sort of both political in their own way. Our very own Liz Truss and the Lettuce, which you think that was a comparison which has some merit, I know you have some qualifications, and indeed the President of China. I'm liking that one.
Yeah, so I'll maybe come back to Truss, but President Xi Jinping, when he first met Obama in 2013 in St. Petersburg, back in 2013 you had President Obama going to St. Petersburg, meeting Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, they were all there, hanging out together. And there was a picture of them in the press, the kind of young, lean, effervescent Obama, next to the kind of the stout-laden Xi. And the wags in the press were soon quick to compare them to Tigger and Winnie the Pooh as Xi. And this was not popular in China, but it continued on, this kind of idea of Xi as this sort of plodding, friendly-faced Winnie the Pooh-like figure. He met Shinzo Abe, the Japanese premier, who has kind of a sort of a hound dog, gloomy expression. And they cast him as Eeyore when they met awkwardly, she and Abe. And then later on, Carrie Lam, who was the former chief executive of Hong Kong, the leader of Hong Kong, she liked to wear pastel pink all the time, and she always walked one step behind so she was of course Piglet. But these different kind of Disney-fied versions of she in the Chinese press were soon outlawed, and to the extent that this comparison led to the, I think it was 2018 Christopher Robin film being banned in China. And it created a kind of interesting new sidebar in the West that these comparisons probably shine a lens onto the sort of authoritarianism and that kind of inability to metabolize debate and discussion and leadership style.
I mean, I think it's fascinating because it shows how comparisons and metaphors like that can cut through in a way that perhaps language and other things can't, and therefore has a value. At the risk of being, I mean, are these just comparisons that you like because you broadly agree with the politics behind them? Whereas Donald Trump comparing himself to Nelson Mandela because they're both persecuted by the state and might be imprisoned by it is not something that works for you or you expect a lot of them.
Well, I think all comparison is subjective, and I bring my own biases to this work and I try to acknowledge those and foreground them. And actually, let's go back to Truss here, because she was compared to a lettuce, you remember it, Daily Star, got 60p lettuce from Tesco, and they had a live feed and it went on. She lasted 45 days. The lettuce lasted a bit longer. I don't think I wanted mine.
Which I think speaks a lot for an extraordinary preservative from my rural affairs background. I'm worried about what into that lettuce, but anyway.
But I actually think maybe that went too far, and I think maybe there were gender dynamics to that. I think maybe if that had been a male leader, if Rishi Sunak had won that competition and had introduced a disastrous budget, would he been compared to a lettuce?
Well, I can think of a man who was compared to a vegetable, and that was Graham Taylor, famous former England football manager. After they were beaten by Sweden, it was Swedes 2, turnips 1, and forever after he had a turnip, drawn on his head. So I don't know. I maybe you have greater sensitivity to that than I do, but I'm not sure if it was gendered. Anyway, on that note, I think it's probably best to throw open to the floor here. There is a microphone, so if you could put your hand up in the air. Come on, don't be shy. I'm not expecting shyness in this audience. And Hyman here will come around to you. Yeah, there's a lady in the front here. But please don't be shy. Get thinking about some questions.
Thank you. I'm going to ask about climate change, obviously. I was really interested. I haven't read the book, so I don't know like the full conclusions. I was really interested in the sort of moonshot is a bad comparison for climate change, because I think what you get at is what I've been thinking about a lot recently at the moment with the like political recommendations, which is that the moonshot was something where the values were quite sort of shared. It was a very like science-based decision, which Roger Pilker Jr.'s Honest Broker book, which I was just talking about earlier with Tom, talks about as like tornado politics, when if you want to evacuate from a tornado, it's mainly about science and it's not about values. Climate change he compares to abortion politics, which is complex contested science, and it's a decision. Legalization is not something that's driven by science alone, it's very dominated by values. So like if that's a bad, but humans we know are really bad at thinking about the future and imagining the future. That's why we grab at these comparisons, I think, because they're like a foothold. And so is the answer that we need, did you conclude in the book that we need more artists and creatives to imagine the future and like be stepping away from comparison so that we can actually think of new things and inventions with true creativity rather than reaching for the old?
Comparing to the something genuinely new rather than comparing to the
Yeah, because a lot of creatives are quite interested in this idea of like imagining a better future in climate change. Do you think that's one of the answers?
Well, let me start off by answering that, going back to the moonshot, is that thinking about the science. Well, I heard, this actually comes from Tom Hanks, so I like Tom Hanks. he argued that Charles Lindbergh, the famous aviator, very problematic person, famous aviator, he met the crew which preceded the successful Apollo mission. And he said to them that you guys were the real pioneers. They were the ones who went around the moon for the first time. They were the ones who escaped the Earth's orbit. And he thought the real technical achievement was with them, and that they were the ones who would be remembered by history. And actually, it was more about spirituality and art and performance as the landing on the moon. So I think the science, even in the moonshot, is contested. So I think there's taking Lindbergh's argument as an aviator, not as a very problematic historical figure, but that actually I think there's maybe even on something like the moonshot, I think that they didn't need to get out of the capsule. Getting there, like that, getting out of the capsule, the performance, the speaking the words, that was all art and poetry and theatre and performance. That actually made the science. We could have done that. You need a man to get on or a person to get down there. You could have sent an object down and brought it back up again. So I think science is always mediated through what its cultural resonance is. So I think in terms of, try to answer your question, with climate change, we need to give it, how can it have that cultural face to it? How can it have that resonance?
Thank you. Yes, there's someone in the back with their glasses in the air. Thank you. Yeah, that's you, sir.
I sort of worry that a bullshit comparison could be a good simile, or a good metaphor, or a good analogy. And I'm thinking about the cover of the book, like a woman needs a man, like a fish needs a bicycle. That might be a good analogy, but a bullshit comparison. So I sort of want to know more about what's
Well, you discuss it in the book, don't you? Yeah.
Well, I haven't read the book, so I'm pretty sure that you did amazing.
No,
Just a question.
They'll give you a taste, so you just want more. They'll let them go and buy it.
Yeah, so a woman meets a man like a fish needs a bicycle. Where's this image here? And how can we think about that in terms of comparison? Well, 50 years ago, when Alina,
I'll help you out.
I can't remember the name.
Famous original feminist, I'll just get the name for you.
Alina Baderna was the first who famous this phrase is attributed. And at that time, she was talking about how women can do everything that men can do. But that was a moment in second wave feminism when we thought about, I think there was more the conception of gender relations as kind of parallel tracks, as we want women to have the jobs.
Irina Dunn,
sorry. And men can have those that women can have. But I think that's an outdated way of thinking about inequalities and gender inequalities. And I think now that comparing the idea that the women don't need men or vice versa is not a helpful way. I don't think we want to think about parallel tracks. I think about how collectively we can kind of break down gender norms and values, and I expand the argument to talk about things like males being primary caregivers to their children, how something like Piers Morgan singled out Daniel Craig for wearing a papoose, talked about an emasculated James Bond. And that sort of comparative gesture, I think, is something which is quite problematic. That we want to be, so in the area of gender, we want to be not comparing women and men, but we want to be thinking about how different social roles can be performed evenly across those who have a whole diversity of gender identities.
But the comparison, the metaphor, was a beautiful and witty way of illustrating superfluity, really, wasn't it? And that was the point.
Yeah.
And it did it very, very well for its time. Whether you think it's accurate now, or even, I don't think it was necessarily accurate then, it delivered something, didn't it?
Yeah, and I think it worked in that moment. But I think society's progressed now, and I do a lot of caring for my own young children, and I've had encounters. The one I use in the book as an example would be when I was trying to get into a nursery and getting a stubborn, great big double buggy from a narrow door jam. I get in there, scraping the knuckle, coming in, and I eventually get it in, and this female volunteer in this church hall says to me, "Oh, typical male driver." Now, can you imagine if it had been a man in that space who'd said that to a female who brought the pram into that space? And it was a moment where I was flustered, I was stressed, and it shamed me in it. And the subtext of her message was, this is a woman's space, not a man's space. So I think that to me was a woman needs a man like a fish needs a bicycle sort of thing. And so for me, I think that touched upon the way that we shouldn't be gendering things like people's driving ability or their ability to use a brain. We should be helping and facilitating people in these difficult situations.
Very good. We've got a couple there. Let's go with the gentleman with the dark sleeve, and then you, sir.
As a follow-up question, really, because talking about that makes me think of El Nino, La Nina, which I've done some work on, which shows El Nino as being kind of male and La Nina as being female. And you know, if it rains a lot, it must be.
These
female.
are the Southern Ocean currents, aren't they?
Yeah, which is a terrible metaphor. But is it a terrible comparison? I guess my question is, what's the difference between a bullshit metaphor and a bullshit comparison? What's the specific politics of comparisons versus metaphors?
Hey, I told you get into linguistics rather than geography. You can.
Yeah, I kind of, within the introduction, I set out 3 different forms of comparison: comparative metaphors, comparative models, comparative metrics. So yeah, I wouldn't necessarily. So I would kind of think within the broad umbrella of comparisons in general, and then potentially a bullshit comparison. We have metaphors, and I think again, I'm not against comparison, and I love metaphors. I use metaphors all the time in my conversations, in my writing. I think they give texture and excitement to arguments. So I'm not against comparison. I think maybe sometimes we do need shorthands. We need little quick tools and quirks which enable us to remember things. And I think maybe without knowing the kind of dynamics of the north and southern oscillations, then maybe that shorthand works, because in the same way they might say a male and female plug. I don't think that's a bad comparison. It's not the male part of, or not the male part of the plug is the good part and the female part is the bad part. It's just that what they are.
Yeah, comprehensible. Yeah.
Yeah, you talked about, you touched on comparisons requiring sometimes discretisation. You're comparing one place to another, men to women and so on. I mean, certainly, and you also touched on the idea that there probably isn't a sort of anti-comparisons lobby. But I think, in my field, in statistics and genetics, we absolutely despise categorical data. I mean, a lot of it's been built on, population genetics that went down a hellhole of adding fuel to the eugenics movement, and just the idea of categorising things. We really want to be looking at continuous data, continuous genetic variation, where we can get away from these categorical comparisons. As soon as you make these categorisations, whether it's the difference between men and women, you're talking about some ethereal idea of an average man or an average woman. But of course, on any metric, apart from some basic biology, you're looking at huge overlaps in the variance.
And just to do, I think slightly interpretive question, are you in effect saying that when you get to comparisons, you inevitably talk about peaks or summits rather than spectrums, and you think on so many more of these things are in spectrums rather than in single peaks?
It does us all a massive disservice, because as soon as you start, we're moving away from the term population genetics to evolutionary genetics. As soon as you have the idea of populations, you're rarefying these distinct groups, and you're losing the power to investigate what is the underlying processes that cause the variation.
Yeah, I think I completely agree. I think it's a lot of the arguments I've tried to make. I mean, I tend to work with a qualitative world rather than a quantitative world, but there's a big sections on metrics and the use of things like university league tables, hospital league tables, school Ofsted reports. Very dismissive of the ways in which these tend to rarefy differences. They tend to look at achieving excellence in individual units rather than bigger populations, and the destructive impacts they have on health outcomes, education outcomes, and so forth. So and I think for those who are interested in kind of a more data-led interrogation, then there's a book called Calling Bullshit by Bergstone and his co-author, but that looks at this more of a quantitative worldview.
Yeah, but the stuff about education is absolutely fascinating. Obviously, the school league table and the one word comparisons we've been through this year, and sadly they still exist. You still want to ask a question, or are you done? You don't no obligation.
Yeah, no, thanks, Andrew. I remember reading the education statistics chapter 4 years ago, and now listening to the book talk. My question here is, are you not closing the way for kind of analytical generalizations if we speak in qualitative terms for like comparison or generalizations? And I really find problematic this bullshit comparison of let's just with a bullshit.
Sorry, I missed the very last bit. You find which really problematic? I missed the very last thing.
Oh, the comparison of let's just with aliens.
With the latest. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm not against. There are many points where I speak to comparisons being as a positive force. So something like the counterpoint to the list of 100 greatest Britons would be the list of 100 black Britons, which was produced by the black community in response, and it didn't have a single person as a winner. It was a collective celebration of outstanding black individuals, and I think something like that can offer a corrective to some of these comparative models. And I'd also say that, yeah, we do need to have comparison. We don't understand how are we going to understand things like health inequalities, like different performances, gender pay gaps without making comparisons. So I'm not like anti-comparison. It's about the misuse and abuse of them. And of course, I'm not the kind of comparisons referee who decides which is a good one. But yeah, so I think it's always like I bring with this my own politics, my own subjectivities, my own worldview, and by reading this book you'll probably get my perspective on this. And if someone else had come up with these arguments, then yeah, like the Liz Truss one, I'm on the fence with that. I think I think it's problematic. I think Tom was maybe taking a slightly different perspective of it. But so I think there's room for understanding those subjectivities, and I think we can also think about that whilst also we can disagree about some of these issues, but also thinking about some of the deeply problematic roles of comparison in society in general.
Yeah, and you make a very powerful case there for the problematic comparisons, especially with regard to race and migration and things like that, which are particularly pernicious often. Yeah, anybody on this side? I don't want to make it like a pantomime, but yeah, you next. Yeah.
Thanks, Andrew. So I was thinking, why do us as geographers or social scientists do comparisons so much? And I think part of what it comes down to as geographers is this kind of idea of case studies. And within kind of case study selection, there's kind of different reasoning. So like you go for typical or diverse or extreme, divergent, divergent, and there's like a whole list of them. And so I was kind of thinking, well, is it that you're against the comparisons as a whole? But from the last thing you've said, I kind of get the feeling like it's probably more, we need the comparisons, but there needs to be an outright kind of statement of these are what you're comparing against, or like, so can you possibly speak to that, of like, to what extent are comparisons advantageous versus what are the caveats with that? Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, when students ask me how many case studies they can do, I normally say the answer is one case study. But yeah, so I think I think when you make case studies, that's, I think you summed up very nicely there, is that you choose outliers, you choose extreme examples, you don't tend to choose the mundane. So I think maybe like when we are doing comparative studies, I think it's really important to foreground why you're comparing them. And sometimes you're meant to kind of rationalise this, oh, it's randomly selected or whatever. But I would kind of be more explicit in embracing the kind of our own personal politics, which even as academics is always there, always present in our work. Why we choose to study something, it's not that this was the most pressing issue in the universe which had to be resolved. If that was the case, then we'd all be working on, I don't know, we'd all be in the Cancer Research Institute, or we'd all be doing climate change, or we'd all be doing, like, we wouldn't have arts and humanities. We're compelled to work across a terrain of topics because we have our curiosity, we have our academic freedoms. So, and I'd always like to try to foster those, because I think that's where the best work comes from. And yeah, you can still be working in like creative fields and pursuing kind of urgent social issues. Like our colleague Johan Anderson, who's interested in film, he also works much on kind of gay rights and these things, and increasingly like democracy. So these things can come together. So I would say even if you're working in so-called hard science, don't be afraid to be driven by your own beliefs and so what you see is the great injustices and problems which are facing the environment or politics or whatever it may be.
Put your hand up and then she can see where to count. Yep.
Thanks for writing this book, Andrew. I'm actually interested in, when you were writing and thinking about this, your thoughts on difference, because that seems to be like, in order to not make bullshit comparisons, we have to have a better vocabulary or metaphors to think about difference, or even how we approach it as people. Given that categorizations are so important psychologically and like how humans are hardwired to think, but are we teaching difference badly, as academics, as teachers, or are just kind of public consumers thinking about difference? Are there kind of different ways? I guess that's a big question, but maybe more on a concrete level, how did your thinking, writing the book about difference, change when you were actually doing it from beginning to end?
Yeah, no, thanks, Katie. It's really interesting. I think you do reflect on your own privileges, which sounds quite indulgent, but there's a lot of my own. It is quite autobiographical in place. There's a lot of my own personality in this book. There's a lot of personal stories, like quite intimate stories and like intimate moments. So I'm not afraid to sort of show people where I sit socially, and in so doing, I think that helps me to understand those who are different than me. But I think you have to sort of position yourself to be able to understand others. So trying to bring moments when I can, the voices of people that are different to myself to the fore, but also not trying to speak for others with a voice that I don't have. So yeah, I think in some ways I'm probably the wrong person to be writing this book. I think it's actually more powerful if it came from someone who had faced a different series of challenges, and I think that would be maybe a more exciting text. But maybe I can provoke people who come from different backgrounds to work to take this to a more exciting place, to challenge us to think about comparison in a more radical way.
Well, that is very modest, and indeed unnecessarily modest, because you've written a very, very fine book with plenty of challenge and plenty of insight and plenty of thought-provoking stuff, as I think we've just illustrated from our discussion here, and very fine questions from the audience. So we are at time, so it just remains me to do a couple of things really. First of all, to encourage we've scraped the surface in the conversation. There's a lot more in here, and it's all over there, available on the desk. So get your cards out and do a little bit of shopping. Apart from that, I just want to say thank you very much indeed for you coming, and please a big hand for Andrew Brooks.